Dr. Proctor, your talk is so timely since there was a research article that came out last week and it was all over the news. So while we've been asking you to do a talk for a really long time, I was so excited to see that piece on the news because this is a perfect introduction.
Great.
All right, so we're recording now. So I'm going to, without further ado, pass things over to Dr. Stephon Proctor from CHOP so he can introduce himself to you.
All right, thank you, Angela and Susan. So I'm gonna start my presentation and just give me one moment to flip it to my view, and then we will begin. All right, so my name is Stephon Proctor. I am a child and adolescent psychologist at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. I specialize in ADHD. One of the things that makes me more experienced in this topic than I think than some of others is I'm a big tech enthusiast, so I just really love all things technology. So do my kids. I wanted to disclose, because we're going to be talking about screen time, I needed to self-disclose what my screen time habits are. And I tracked it on my phone, and it's about 7 to 8 hours. That's between, this is not work hours. This is like my phone, TV, video games, and all that stuff, which you may say, man, that's a lot. Like, what does he do? But I'm not weird. This is actually pretty common, as I'll show with some data. I also have 2 young children, 4 and 7. That's not the ages there. That's during the pandemic. And you see there, my wife took this picture because she just thought it was very kind of interesting, right? You've got my daughter there watching the TV opposite of her. I've got my phone there, and my son has a little screen, little leapfrog device. And this is very common, right? I know some of y'all feel me because you've probably been in a similar state, especially if you look at the year was during the pandemic. So we know a lot of children and adolescents were getting increased amounts of screen times during then. And even me being a professional, I fell right into that too. You had to survive, right? So here's the agenda for what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to just do a simple definition of what screen time is. I'm going to do a quick recap on things like the data, looking at the trends in screen time use over time in between demographic groups. I'm going to illustrate some of the benefits and the risk of screen time in general, and then talk more specifically about that for ADHD. And then I'll spend the remainder of our time talking about what everyone's most interested in is how do we manage screen time with our children. Screen time has a very basic definition. I think if you ask most people, what is it? It's the time that they spend on a screen. And as I'll get into, there are many different definitions of what a screen is, but simply put, screen time is just minutes or hours that are spent with a device that has a screen. So something like a radio wouldn't be included unless it has a screen. But it's really important to keep in mind that all screens are not created equal. And we know that now. Back in the day, there were fewer screen options, but there are many different subcategories of screens. And the way that you use those screens can have different purposes. Educational screen time, this can be things that the school requests that your children do as part of an assignment, but there could also be just informal learning activities that they do via an app, a website, or a video. You have passive screen time. This is very similar to what we would say, if you're vegging out on the couch watching TV. You're not interacting in any way. You're just passively receiving the content from a video or something like that. Active screen time is you're engaging, but you're actually engaging in a more physical way. Some of our kids have used devices like the Wii or something like that, where it has little controllers, or like a dance game where those kids, like in the screenshot there, are moving around and they're kind of getting up and moving, but they're still doing it with a screen interface. Interactive screen time is more where you're doing something like a game, where there's kind of a back and forth, a lot of movements with the keyboard or the mouse or with the screen. Then you have social screen time. This is just what it sounds like, your social media, your text messaging, all of that. And then what you're seeing a lot more popular is things like content creation, using screens in their capacity to do things like digital art, coding, or making music in really creative ways. So now I'll talk about what we're seeing with screen time over time. So many of you probably remember those early televisions. We had one just like this in our living room, And it was the only screen that we had for a very long time. And it was in the living room, and we all had to share and dial those little knobs in there, and you had your little rabbit ears. And the first televisions were introduced in the 20s. And then about 50 years later, that's when you started to have video game consoles, your Ataris or Commodores, but they still weren't as common as what we're seeing today. And then in the early aughts, you start to see what I call the big bang of screen time. And when I was making this slide, I was really amazed at how many of these things happened in such a short span of time. We kind of feel like a lot of these things were either new or been around for quite a while, and they're actually not. They're fairly recent, and they all sort of happened within a short span of time. You had your YouTube getting launched, and then you had Facebook open up to kind of a wider audience because it was just colleges when it first started. Then you had the first iPhone, and you see right there is a very simple one. I had one of those. And then Netflix was launched. And then everything, right? These really set the foundation for a lot of your very accessible, nonstop content sources, right? There's no end to Facebook, YouTube, or Netflix, right? That you can scroll forever. And this is really when that started, and where a lot of people, especially kids and adults, got hooked. So I think it's pretty clear, and you probably already get this, that smartphone ownership has grown. As kids get older, they're more likely to, have a smartphone. And we're also finding that even at younger ages, younger cohorts of children are getting smartphones than their previous generations. So I'll show you some slides here. I don't want you to get too kind of overwhelmed by the data, but one of the things I really want to point out here is what you're seeing between these trend lines. So you have 2015, 2019, and 2021. And these are your age groups right here. So for example, in 2015, 11% of 8-year-olds had a smartphone, like that owned it, not were using them. But then in 2021, that tripled nearly to 31%. So at every age group, you are seeing a bump in ownership of having a smartphone. But not only that, you're seeing that the older a child gets, the more likely they are to have a smartphone, to the point where you get into the high 80s and 90s. And of course, if we were to do this study in 2023, 2024, I'm pretty confident we'd see a huge shift upward there. No surprise. Let's also talk about other kind of ways that we can look at the data for screen time. We all went through the pandemic, and if you look at this little bump right here, when we're looking at 2019, we saw 17% increase in screen time use average per day, which is really huge. So now you're averaging, with your tweens, about eight hours a day. We are seeing some demographic shifts. We're seeing things like boys are using it more than girls. We're seeing minorities are using it more than non-minorities, and we're seeing that children in higher incomes are using screen time less than children in middle or low income neighborhoods. Now, the next thing is, well, what are they doing with it? Okay, well, there's a lot of data about what they're doing. Most time is spent in that passive or social category. And nowadays, a lot of these things kind of overlap. They used to be pretty distinct categories, and now the development of a lot of these websites and platforms are to really merge that together. So in some ways, something like TikTok, which is in the center, it's passive, but it's also social because you can use that to connect with your friends. Roblox is a popular game that a lot of children are playing, and you can also communicate. So it's a video game, but it's also a social component there. But this is really where the data is showing us that this is what most of their activity is spent doing. I have some other slides that I'm just going to quickly, illustrate this to a point. This is average screen time use with children, and you're finding, again, most of their time is spent on videos and gaming, and they're not doing much with things like browsing websites or video chatting. When you look at other things, like what are they doing, it's usually things like watching YouTube, video on demand, your Netflix, your Disney Plus, all of those things, gaming. You see TikTok again, it's very popular. When you look at teenagers, similar categories: YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, video games, Instagram. No surprise, I'm not really telling you anything you didn't know, but look at the magnitude. That's really huge. That's what most of that time is going. So if you're ever curious what they're doing, this is likely where all that time is being spent. Now, of course, I'll talk about the benefits and the risk, and I'm really going to highlight a big philosophy of mine, and that screens are not inherently bad. And if you come with that philosophy, it's going to make it really hard for you to manage this with your children. You really need to have a very balanced perspective on this. I think a lot of us get that, but I think when we think about how it applies to our children, we seem to kind of treat it differently and think, well, for them, a lot of it is bad, but for us, it's okay or not so bad. So let's look at those differences. Now, I know I'm breaking one of the rules of PowerPoint by having too much text, but I really want to be mindful here that I know that these slides are things that you may want to like read or process later. So I do have a lot of the information on here, but again, I'm not going to read everything here. The benefits are in a lot of the categories that you know, and some of the ones I already highlighted. Of course, we know that it increases educational access. Even if you're a low-income family, as long as you have internet access, you can access educational content. The barrier to that has been lowered by how common technology is and how accessible it is. Again, that can help with skill development. We know it helps with social connectivity. That's one of the big reasons that you're seeing on those charts there. We know that in addition to some of those other activities, it can offer opportunities for creativity. It also offers some way of structuring your downtime. And then for some children, it helps them prepare for the future. A lot of jobs in future generations are going to be in the tech-oriented field, programmers and so on. You're seeing a lot of schools offering things like coding classes. You're seeing a lot of people going into software engineering. You're hearing about all these tech startups. This is where a lot of our jobs in society are going. Kids having access to technology really makes them a lot more tech literate than previous generations. Now, on the other side, we need to be thinking about the risk of screen time. We know that for a lot of children with ADHD, screen time can really exacerbate the attention difficulties that they have. The health consequences of screen time are pretty well known. We know that screen time before bed is a big no-no. We know that a lot of sedentary activity, just sitting around on a device, can lead to things like, or contribute to things like obesity and other health issues. For some children, you do see an increase in behavioral issues, a lot more irritability, anger, for some kids, even depression, especially if they're using social media in an inappropriate way. If you're spending a lot of time on your screens, that may come at the expense of something like academics, homework, studying, and things like that. And of course, when you hear about things in the news, you always hear about things like privacy and safety issues, whether it's online predators or inappropriate communities and things like that, because a lot of these are unregulated in a lot of these platforms. So let's talk about specifically for ADHD, the issues that we see. So children with ADHD, I would say, are a lot more of a vulnerable population. And this is inherent to a lot of the symptoms of ADHD. Impulsivity is one of the core symptoms, especially of one of the subtypes, the inattentive. Children with ADHD, as we know, often have a hard time with impulse control. Thus, it makes it harder for them to regulate their screen time. That means things like setting limits on how much they're going to spend on it, whether they can desist and not use screen time. That impulsivity just makes it very easy for them to engage in that. We know that with ADHD, they often hyper-focus on tasks that are super fun and engaging. TV, screens, video games, they are very engaging. And that's what keeps many of us engaged on it. It's not boring. There's not just a flat screen. There's usually a lot of action, a lot of interaction. We know that children with ADHD are often super bored. They need a lot of stimulation. Screens fit right into that and relieve that boredom. We know that for some children with ADHD, having difficulties with social challenges is actually like often a side effect for them. And so they may find that interacting with their friends on social media or on social games actually works better for them, because maybe in person, a lot of children don't want to play with them because they're impulsive, they speak too much, they rush to the front of the line. But online, people are a little bit more forgiving, or you can be a lot more anonymous, so it's not as much of a problem. Again, we know that with ADHD, there's a huge need for stimulation, so that fast-paced nature of digital content is really appealing to them. And we often find that screen time is a huge source for avoidance. Oftentimes with ADHD, there's an avoidance of doing things that are boring or not their preferred activities. And so screen time offers a huge alternative for them to try to spend more time doing that and less of the things that we or teachers or other people need them to do. So then what's the impact of this? Well, we know that one of the challenges with ADHD is poor attention and poor working memory. A lot of children with ADHD can get lost in their screens, and they can forget to do those tasks that we know they know how to do. Even with teenagers, parents will often say to me, he knows how to do this, but he keeps forgetting. Well, if you're spending a lot of time on screens, a lot of that working memory is devoted to that screen and not to these other things. We only have so much mental capacity to hold information in our brain. And if that's being used up by a screen, you can believe that anything else that you need them to do or the teacher needs them to do is going to take second or third place there. Sleep can be a huge challenge for patients with ADHD. Winding down for bed in general is hard for kids and teens with ADHD. And then if they're using a screen just before, we know that this is affecting things like their melatonin production and things like this. Blue light, you often hear about blue light and things like that. That's contributing to that. So if they're already having trouble sleeping and then we have a screen just before bed or in the room, this is a very common one. I work with parents and I say, tell me about your son or daughter's sleep habits. And I ask if they have a TV, and 9 times out of 10, they're like, yeah, and it helps them fall asleep. That's not actually true, but I get that it is a common thing that you're used to, but it actually, no doctor is going to say, yes, the TV is actually helping your child sleep. But I get that as a parent, it's sometimes easier to have that because eventually they will fall asleep. When children with ADHD make risky or impulsive decisions, screens really increase that risk. They may not be thinking twice about, well, what if I talk to this person that I don't know? Okay, I'm just going to answer their questions or allow them to be my friend, or let me go to that website and really not think twice about it. In real life, parents are often concerned about risky decisions like, walking out in front of the, across in a crosswalk without looking left or right for cars. Well, in the digital world, there's different risks, but you still need to stop and think. And with ADHD, it just makes it more likely they'll make a not so good decision because they're not really thinking through the consequences. We know that time management is a struggle for children and teens with ADHD, and screens don't really help that if they're not used appropriately. If they need to manage their time to focus on a task such as homework and they're spending more time on screens, that's really going to mess with their ability to estimate how much time they need for this task versus that. Like I said before, we know that screens can be a huge homework distraction. A lot of teens tell me, oh, well, I like to have my phone out while I'm doing my homework. Like, what are you doing? Oh, I'm answering text messages. I'm checking on TikTok. I'm checking all my notifications. We all know your phone has no shortage of notifications to let you know anything and everything that is happening. And that's really what the manufacturers want. They want you to keep looking at your phone and to swipe and open and browse and all of that. You can imagine if you have ADHD, it's that shiny ball all over again. For many children with ADHD, transitions can be really, really hard, especially when they're doing a preferred activity. Screens often make it that much harder because that huge effect that it has on the brain in terms of providing that stimulation. When you find that you need to have them transition from one thing to another, sometimes it doesn't go too well. Sometimes it may lead to tantrums, anger, or other outbursts because you're really moving them from something that has amazingly high stimulus value to something that usually is much lower. For some kids, there becomes this huge dependence on screens. I can't do anything fun. I can't have fun unless I'm on my screen. I can't go to a restaurant or to church unless I have my screen. I can't sit still unless I have my phone. I often see this in waiting rooms when kids come to see us for evaluations. As soon as the kid is bored, parent whips out the phone, hands it to the kid. So the kids really then don't develop a tolerance or an ability to do something else without a screen that can maintain their attention. I think oftentimes parents, they don't want to admit it, but sometimes it's a dependence for us too, because it's just easy for us in the short term to say, here you go, because it is just easier to kind of keep them stimulated. And you know that it works. And so you're both getting reinforced as well. So now let's talk about the ways to manage our screen time. So I just want to point out general things that I think we all get, but they're worth really repeating. So screen time or screens are not going away. They're here. They're here to stay. They're going to grow.
You just muted yourself, I think.
All right, there you go. I think I dragged something over. So I think where I was saying is screen time, it's ubiquitous. It's not going away. If you don't want screens, you need to be like this family up here that is living off the grid in something called a yurt. If you don't know what a yurt is, look it up. It's very interesting. But this family has no screens, and I'm sure it fits with their values, but you really have to go to the extreme if you just want to get away from them. And most of us aren't there yet. I mean, if you're on this call, you're using a screen. Screens are a mixed blessing. There are some good things about it, like I said, and there's some risk. And we really just need to own up to that instead of just seeing it as all of a negative blessing. Some children need a lot more guidance than others. There are definitely kids where if you give them some structure, some expectations on it, they can manage it pretty well. Others need a heavier load of that. And so you really just need to keep that in mind, that even within siblings, you may find that there's a difference between who really is struggling with having too much screen time and who just needs a few, some structure, and they're going to be okay. You also want to make sure, and I'll kind of lead into this when I'm talking more about some of the ways to manage this, don't ignore the benefits. The approach should not be, how do I just completely reduce screen time? It's more of, how do I vary, if anything, what the screen time is being used for? So some of you may be aware of, there are these general screen time guidelines. The American Academy of Pediatrics has a well-known breakdown where, at certain ages, they recommend maybe 1 or 2 hours per day. I'm not going to lie, like, this is just, it's well-intended, but I do not think it's realistic in this day and age. I showed you the data on how much it's being used. It blows these numbers out of the water. And I really do think, because of the way that society is structured, a lot of the way that we educate our children, the way that we communicate, the way we keep in touch, the way we socialize, the way we have fun, these limits don't really take that into mind. I know these guidelines are really helpful for giving some people that structure, but I think if you were to try to really keep it down to this, it is doable for some families, but it is really hard. So I'm going to talk a little bit more flexibly about it, rather than just saying, all right, everyone on this call, look at your child's age, make the number that and stick to it, because it's going to fail. So let's talk about some different strategies. As I said earlier, you really just need to accept and embrace where we're at with screens. Learn the different ways that screens can be beneficial. There are tons of educational websites, videos, games, programs. All screen time doesn't have to be TikTok and, video games. It can be a lot of things that in the long term are benefiting our children for the better. We all like our entertainment. I'm sure many of you have your little TV shows, your drama, your Sunday football games. That is screen time, and you know it. We just don't call it screen time. You just say it's daddy's football time. It's still a screen. And yes, you're getting something out of it, right? Enjoying being a fan or the entertainment of the Desperate Housewives. But what's it really doing for you in the long run? Not much educationally, but it's fun in the short term. I get that. Your kids get that too. I think a big thing, and I love this picture here, we got to try to practice what we preach. A lot of us, and I'm throwing myself in that, we spend a lot more time on our screens than we want to. And our kids see that. I have young kids, and they're very aware of when I'm on my screen, because I may not have answered a question right, or they see that I'm looking down at my phone. We all do it. Some of us do it more than less. But the thing is if we're trying to work cooperatively on reducing their screen time, we have to find ways to manage that, or at least model that in a way that helps them see, I'm going to manage mine and I'm going to help you manage yours. It is very hard to have this kind of double standard. A lot of parents bring that up with me. They're like, well, they have to understand that I'm the mom or I'm the dad and it's different for me. That I get that, but that's not a strong argument for our children. They're not like, oh, okay, I get it. The rules are different for you. So you need to think about how much time are you spending on screens? A lot of our devices, whether you have an Apple device or a Google, they already have software built in to help you personally manage how much screen time. So with Apple, it's actually called Screen Time. So you can, search for that. On Google, it's called Family Link. And you could just turn it on and have it calculate how much time you spend. And maybe a couple weeks later, look back and say, wow, I actually spend more time than I did. On average, the data says that adults spend about 9 hours per day on screens combined. So this is including your phones, your televisions, and things like that. Take this out. I think we should separate out like work, because for some jobs, you just can't get away from it. So if you take it out of the realm of work, they're still spending a lot of time outside of work. Now, in terms of how do you communicate this to children? Younger, just like with anything, younger is better. When you start early with kids, I like to start as early as the first time you give them their first screen, or the next time you get them a new screen or an updated screen or things like that. A lot of what I see in clinical practice is it happens very backwards. Parents will have the screens given to their kid, used by their kids, and then years later they're saying, oh my gosh, they're using it too much. How do I walk this back? And that's much harder to do, rather than, this is the phone I am letting you use. Because again, a lot of kids will say, well, this is my phone. It ain't your phone. I don't know many kids that are paying for their device and for the internet access for that. I mean, if they are, that is amazing. You've got like a very interesting situation. But in general, these are the devices that we provide for our children to use. And so, just like riding a bike, we're going to teach them how to do it appropriately. When you teach your child how to ride a bike, we make sure they have their protection, right? We make sure we watch how they're doing it. We're modeling. We're doing it right next to them. We're letting them know when to stop, when to go, and what to do when there is, when crossing the street. But then for some reason, we give them this phone and we're like, here you go, make good decisions. We would never give a kid a bike and be like, there you go, figure it out. So really, I want you to kind of you think I'm joking, but I want you to really think about them in the same way. Why don't we think about these two things? And the bike, you could argue, doesn't even have as many risks as the phone does. The phone has so many more risks that we can't even imagine. The bike is very tangible. It's only when they can ride it. The phone, your kid can have this at midnight doing something they're not supposed to do. So take the time to talk, teach, and take part in screen time. Talk about it in a balanced way. Hey, here are some good things that we like about screens, and here are some things that are some concerns and risk about screen times. Model it. Show them how you use it. Well, sometimes I use it for entertainment when I watch my football games, but sometimes I use it to learn. Here's a documentary about something. Or sometimes I use it for something creative, coming up with a drawing for something that I want to do. When they see that you're using it in these more balanced ways, their use and their expectations of it can also be a lot more balanced, instead of it just being this kind of fight between what you want them to do and what they want to do. I think another way to think of it is almost like when you think about desserts, is if you think about a diet for a meal or something like that, screen time is sort of like the chocolate or, the dessert. And yeah, we're not saying dessert is bad, but how much of it are you having? If that's all you're having, we would say that's a problem. But if you've eaten a well-rounded lunch or a dinner, having that screen time is not so bad. And really, again, there's a balance between these things. It's not an all or nothing type of thing. I really like the concept, and they call this the play diet. And so let's kind of expand more beyond screens to just free time, play, active, being kids and teens. If we really think about kind of all of these different types of activities as a well-balanced child in terms of play, we'll find that we can replace screen time with a broader diet of play. So digital play, right in the red, that is what you would say is more of your screen time, right? It's digital. It uses some device. Then you have social play. Social play is playing with peers, siblings, parents, teammates. This can be things like board games, going to the playground, talking, imaginative play, things like that. Social play is really helpful, right? You can learn things like communication skills, negotiation skills, empathy, sharing, and all that. You can't learn that on TikTok. You can, maybe observe that people are doing that, but there's not a bi-directional, there's not a back and forth with a lot of our digital devices, especially with a human. Active play, this is activities where the physicality is really the core of that. Sports, walking, riding a bike, tag, even exercising in a video game, that falls in line because the main point of it is physical, but it may have a digital component in there. We know that active play has obvious benefits for things like your mental health and physical health. We can't say the same for your digital play, right? Just like I said earlier, creative play, this is more imaginative, and it doesn't have to be arts and crafts. It can be things like exploring, building with Legos, coding, hands-on stuff, construction kits, whatever it is. It's creating something that maybe wasn't there in the first place. But if you kind of step back, you'll see, just like when we grew up, there were a lot of things to do. And what I often see is that kids, their interests become very, very narrow. This kid climbing the tree illustrates a family that I worked with. So it was about 6 years ago, and the mom was just fed up. She had 3 kids, and they were using screens way too much, and she could not figure out how to end it. So she said everyone, including the adults, was going to take a digital cleanse. So for a week, they severely restricted screen time. She said for the first 2 to 3 days, the kids were dying. They were just going through withdrawal. They were moody. They were angry. They were super bored. We have nothing that we can do. There's nothing fun in the house or outside of the house. And she said by the 3rd and 4th day, they were outside climbing trees again. That tree had always been there, but they were just going to do something else because they got to a point where they were like, well, what about physical or active play? We don't have screens anymore. And so they climb trees. And a lot of kids enjoy climbing trees. But you know what? They forget that they like to do those are options because there's always a screen time option that is easily accessible and available exactly when they need it. And that's where we get ourselves stuck is we're focusing so much on how do I put a lock on their device and stop them from doing this. Let's think about that plate that we offered them from dinner where we're kind of rounding it out with a lot of different options so they have some variety. We're not saying 0 screen time because that's impossible, but what about all the other times there? Now, I'm going to talk about controlling screen time because you got to still, have that way of doing it because you can do all of those great steps that I talked about, starting early, communicating, modeling, having a well-balanced play diet. But kids are going to be kids, right? If you say you can only have 3 hours today, especially to your kid with ADHD, they're going to stick to 3 hours unless they are very rule driven, right? A lot of kids and frankly adults are going to spend more time than that. So you really need to think about some of the ways that we control these devices beyond just our words. I think it's really important, especially with younger children, to make sure they give that you give permission before they use the device. I know this is not common, but this can be things like, Daddy, can I use the iPad now? And if I think it's not a good time because we're about to do homework, we're about to eat dinner, we're about to go out, I say no. And my daughter can't access it because I have a passcode on it. And she doesn't know the passcode. She tries to find out, but she doesn't know it yet. And if she does find out, I'm going to change that passcode because I want a way to restrict when she should have access to that device. Now, when she gets older, with teens, it's a little bit trickier because their devices are used often and more commonly, but you could start to structure times such as maybe dinner time or this amount of time before bed. We have to put devices away. All the devices get stacked up next to, the front door or something like that, including adults. Everyone is just going to stack them up. We're not taking away for the whole night, but we're all as a family going to have a conversation. We're going to all play a board game. We're going to do something together that doesn't involve having our screens. And that's kind of a little bit of a compromise. There are ways to kind of limit the utility of devices. Things like turning off internet access is a really powerful one, because wouldn't you believe it? Most of these screens need to connect to the internet to be fun. As soon as you cut that internet, I mean, it's a brick. The kids are like, I am not interested in a phone that doesn't do anything with the internet. So there are families that will kind of go that far. And again, you have to be able to set some sort of hard backstop to ultimately control excessive screen time use. I would love that we could just give our kids some guidance and they would just follow our directions. But you probably wouldn't be here if it was that easy. You'd be like, I just tell my kid the right thing to do and they do it every time. Look at me. It's not that easy, even with kids that don't have ADHD. Now, there are screen time controls in almost every device that our children are using. And a lot of caregivers don't even know this. Even things like your PlayStations, your Xbox, your Nintendo Switches, they have screen time controls. Now, those are not on the front screen for you to find out about. Sometimes it takes a little bit of exploring, Googling YouTube videos to help you find that out. But these devices often have software that helps caregivers set time limits on apps. So maybe, you can only use TikTok for an hour a day, and you can only do this other thing for, 30 minutes a day. You can even set times of day when they can be active. So there are parents that I've worked with where during the school hours, they will use an app to restrict anything but like maybe phone calls for like mom and dad during school hours. Because why do you need social media when you're in class? Teachers don't appreciate it. Principals don't appreciate it. No one but you and your friends do. And it's not productive during those instances. If you need to get a hold of your child, there's still ways of doing that without them having open access to the rest of the apps on their phone. So I really encourage parents to do the other things that I talked about, but also really look into the controls. You really can't do it otherwise. I don't really have any other way of saying it. It's doing it based on hope or promises is only going to go so far. If you have a child who's very impulsive, they will find a way to get access to these screens. I do know that for some families, it is hard for parents to keep up on like how to do these things. I would say reach out to other family members, your nephew who's tech savvy, your neighbor, your coworker who seems to get computers more, like, help me out with setting limits on my son's phone, or coach me through this. And I've done that, during my sessions. I have nephews who live out of state, but my brother, who has 3 children, he asked me to help set screen time limits for his kids. So what we did is I logged into his Comcast router, and we were able to set screen time limits for each of his children's devices on school days. He didn't know how to do that, but I knew how to do that. And so his kids, they were not happy with me, but in the long run, they were not spending 8 hours a night. They were spending 3 hours a night on screens, and then it would just shut the internet off. It's okay. But they had to find other activities, right? Some of these kids are very artistic, but they weren't doing their art because they could just be on Roblox all day. So if you don't know how to do this technological piece, outsource it. There are lots of resources online or people that can help you. But again, start with the strategies that I talked with first. However, you need a backstop. Without a backstop, everything flies right through. Now, I want to spend time on one more topic. This is rare, but it's worth being said because when it happens, it's actually pretty debilitating. There are kids and teens and even adults who have serious compulsions or addictions to screens. In our diagnostic manual for mental health disorders, there is a newer condition called internet gaming disorder. These are people who are severely addicted to the point where it's taking over activities like school, jobs, personal relationships, and despite having negative consequences like being fired, divorce, or so on, they continue to escalate in using these screens despite the negative consequences. This is a very rare condition. It's still being, looked at to really understand the root causes of it. There are therapies, individual or even inpatient treatment facilities for individuals who really have serious, gaming or internet compulsions. Again, this is very rare. I don't want you coming out of here and being like, oh my God, I think my child's like addicted. These things can be addicting, but a true addiction has a higher level of impairment than just my daughter really likes being on her phone at all, times of the day. But I want to put that out there in case this has ever kind of come up for anyone, or someone, they're like, there actually is a more severe version of what, Dr. Proctor was talking about. So to wrap it up, screens are common. Everyone's got them in some way or capacity, and they're in greater use, between the ages and over time. And that's only going to just happen more and more. And that's not inherently a bad thing. There are benefits to screens. There are also risks. Like I said earlier, children and teens with ADHD are particularly vulnerable because a lot of those core symptoms play right into screens filling the need, whether it's easily being bored, being impulsive, needing stimulation, all of that. And so that they're a population that we particularly need to watch out for. I really then want you to think about the management of this as more of like managing a meal or a diet, not how much can I take away the screens or stop them from doing this, but how can I kind of think about this more holistically? How do I inform my child about the dangers of social media? How do I educate them about, what are the benefits, but also the risk of it? How do I set times for screen use? Parental control, screen time limits, all of that. Am I even offering any alternatives? Am I just sitting here being like, stop using that, but not giving them opportunities or suggesting opportunities for them, like active play, imaginative play, and things like that? And again, lead by example. Practice what you preach. It's really easy to say one thing, but if you're doing the opposite, it is really making it hard for our children to understand and respect that our decisions we mean what we say. And it's really important to really do that introspection and say, do I have a problem that I need to work on if I'm going to help my child work on that? All right, so now we're going to move to questions. There was one sent in advance. Thank you for sending that. How can I get my teenager to cooperate with screen time boundaries, considering it's their main social outlet, which is also very important in their lives? I totally agree with that last sentiment. It's a main social outlet because honestly, this is how a lot of teenagers are connecting. A lot of parents are like, well, why don't they just like call each other on the phone? I'm like, that's played out. They don't do that anymore. It's just like, that's like old school. Like, I had a dad, he was like, well, could I like just get her an email address instead? I was like, you're gonna get her she's gonna email her friends? Like, that's just not what teenagers do. Maybe with your teacher, but that's not how they connect. And so it is very, we do need to empathize with the fact that this is a common way of socializing. And for some, it is an important part of their livelihood, but it's not the only one. Again, we want to be thinking more holistically. What opportunities can we facilitate and encourage or even set limits on so that, yes, social is your outlet, but there are in-person social opportunities. There are also digital social opportunities. And so really rounding that out. Again, you can encourage these things, but you still do need to have a very clear expectation on how much time are you okay with them spending, connecting with their friends this way, but then how much time do they need to spend something else? Because if your teenager said to you, well, what's really important to me is only eating dessert. It just really makes me happy. And this is like how I fulfill my life. I think you'd be like, okay, and you got to eat the rest of the things on your plate. I know that's meaningful to you. And it's not exactly healthy to only have dessert. So I understand that you really only like dessert and you got to eat your vegetables, your meats, and your proteins and things like that. So again, it can be balanced. And as caregivers, we still have to have a very clear way of still setting those firm limits in a way that is flexible. As our teens get older, you probably already realize the amount of structure and expectations you can apply is harder than when they're much younger. And so as they get older, there is going to be a lot more of this negotiation of, how much more time can they spend? keeping something like a 2-hour limit from the time that they're 11 to the time that they're 18 is not realistic. It doesn't developmentally kind of age well, so to speak. And so you do need to be thinking about, well, are they mature enough to handle this? Have they shown me that they're doing it very well? So it may not be a bad thing that a teenager is spending a lot of their digital social time on devices. However, are they taking care of the other things in their life? How are their grades? How are they treating others at home? Are they taking care of their chores? If they're showing you that they're having a well-rounded lifestyle, then you may be able to shift that proportion of how much of their playtime is digital. All right. So that is the end. I did have some possible topics, but I also wanted to now switch it to Angela if there were any questions from the group.
There is another one in the chat.
Okay. All right. So I can read this here. Could the social media increase usage numbers you mentioned, minorities versus minorities, be because minorities, especially youth, stream from YouTube versus paying for cable, income disparities? Yes. So Jackie, that's a great question. When I looked into that, because I was like, what's this difference as well? It seems like there's a lot of potential reasons for that. I do think the amount of money you have offers you greater opportunities, right? So, paying for cable, which is a cost monthly and things like that. But there's also an argument that youth who are non-minorities who have higher incomes also have money for other activities like sports that may cost money, like travel soccer, lacrosse, joining a club, what are those things like basketball? Some families actually just have more opportunities, either because they live in a district that has a lot of those opportunities for the youth. Whereas if you live in an area that doesn't have many opportunities, it's actually easier to just focus on one thing like a screen because you don't have as much flexibility. And so I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I don't think there's anything inherent in being like African American that makes us like use it more. Like it's a thing we pride in ourselves. I just think you'll find that race and socioeconomic status often correlate really highly with each other. And so you really want to think, is it racial, cultural, or is it actually economics, where you live, your neighborhood? Some parents will tell me that their neighborhood is so dangerous, they don't let their kids play outside. You go to school, you go to church, and you come right back. So then what is their child going to do inside? I guess they're going to go on a screen, right? There's not many other things for them to do. And so that's kind of another source of it there, versus if you felt like your kids can go climb a tree and be safe, then you're going to let them outside and climb the tree.
Okay, so we're actually still recording, but this was really, really good. I kind of don't want to stop the recording for the people who are missing it. But if there's anybody has questions, I do want to respect that. So I am going to stop it reluctantly.